In this video, we're going to see how we can work with multiple Django forms on a web page and how we can dynamically fetch extra forms as we need them using HTMX. We're going to see how we can submit these forms one at a time on the page, and also how to submit all of the forms with one click and use HTMX to submit that data. And finally, as we add these forms, we're going to see the page update with the new database data shown on the page, again all using HTMX. So let's get started. Now, a lot of this content was inspired by this repository here. It's a Django HTMX to-do list. I'll leave a link to this below the video and you can explore the code in this repository. And what we're going to do is achieve something quite similar in this video, but we're going to use a contact list to do it. So what we're going to do is go to VS Code, and we're going to start by going to models.py, and I'm going to define a contact model for this application. This will inherit from Django's model. And I'm just going to paste in two fields here. Firstly, the name, which is a char field, and also a char field is the phone number. Now, in a real application, you might want to use Django phone number field or something similar for the phone number, but we'll keep it simple for this video. We may also have a dunder string method that returns the name of the contact. After we've done that, we can run the make migrations command. That will generate our migration file. And once we've done that, we can then run the migrate command to generate the database in this local directory. So if we minimize this, you can see we now have a SQLite file here. If we now go to forms.py, what I'm going to do is create a form here called contact form, and that's going to inherit from the forms.ModelForm class, and then we can define an meta class within that. And we can link this model form to a model, and of course that's going to be the contact model, which I need to import from the local directory's models file. So let's import the contact, and we can set the fields that we want to display in this model form. We're going to use the contact's name and also their phone number as well. So we want to display both of those fields that we had here within the model class. And I want to add one more field to this meta class, and that's a widgets dictionary. And we're going to link both the name and the phone number to a widget, and that's going to be a forms.text input, and that's actually the default for a char field, but what we're going to do is provide a dictionary of extra attributes here, and I'm going to provide the class of form control to each of these text inputs. So let's copy this line to below as well, and remember we need a comma here because this is a dictionary, and we can use the phone number for the second key in this widget. So basically what we're doing here for both of these text fields, we're adding a class of form control to the underlying input element, and we can do that by passing a dictionary of attributes to the widget itself, which is the text input. Now, the form control class, it comes from Bootstrap, and I have Bootstrap loaded into this project, as you can see here on line 9. We have the CSS for Bootstrap, and we also have HTMX loaded into this base template, and we have an index.html. We're going to work in this file here, and this extends the base.html template, so that's our setup for this video. So now that we've added our model and the form class, let's go to views.py. At the top here, I'm going to bring those two things into this views.py file, and then we'll define an index view just below here. So let's create a variable called context. And what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate our form, and we can do that and pass it to a form key. So let's instantiate the contact form, and then below that we can return the render function. We pass that the request and also a template that we want to actually render here. So the template we're going to render is just the index.html template, and we'll pass the context to that template. That's just this template here that we had. At the moment that only contains an h1 tag, so we're going to extend that now. Now, to begin with, let's just render the form with paragraph tags so we can see how that looks on the page. Let's run the Django server and we can go to the browser. So this is how the form looks by default. You can see that it's extended across the screen. It's using that Bootstrap form control class in order to show this form. So what we're going to do is change up this form. We want each form to appear on one line. So we're going to use the Bootstrap row class. And we also need to create the form element itself. So let's go back to our index.html, and we're going to define a form element. And let's remove this form as paragraph, and we can end the form element here. So remember, the goal of this video, we want multiple forms on a page, and we want one per row on the page. So we're going to define that div with a class of row, and this comes from Bootstrap 5. So we're enclosing the form fields within a row, and for each field we want to take up 4 columns out of Bootstrap's 12 column grid system. And on medium sized screen we want to make it a little bit smaller and only take up 3 columns. So we can use this div with a class of col4 and colMedium3, and we're going to create one of them for each field in the form, and there are only 2 fields, so I'm just going to copy this and paste it below. And within each div we need to refer to the form field, so I'm going to paste more code in here. This is for the form.name, and that refers to the contact form's name field, and that's the name of the contact that we want to add on this form. So we're rendering out the name field, and we can add a label here which we can link to the form.name field. And we're going to do the exact same for the phone number field, so I'm going to paste some code just below here. Again, we're using the form class and we're referring to the phone number field within the form, and again we're adding a label and we're linking the for attribute of that label to the ID of our field. So that's the two fields in the form. They're added to a bootstrap row, and the final thing we need to do here is add a button. So I'm going to add another div here, and we'll give that a class of column3. And let's close that div off just below here, and within the div we can add a button element, and this button is going to have the text of submit, and we can close that off. Within the button itself we want to give it some bootstrap styles, for example button and button primary, and we'll also give the button a type of submit here. So this is the form element, and eventually we want to submit this with HTMX, and we also want to be able to get new instances of this form using a button on the UI. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to cut the form out of this template, and we're going to paste it into a partial called form.html. So this partial just contains the form element and all of the fields, as well as a button to submit the form. If we go back to index.html, what we can do is we can create another div here, and we're going to give it an ID of contact forms. And within that div, we're going to use Django's include template tag, and we can include that partials/form.html template, and that will bring that form here into the parent template at this location. So just as a sanity check, let's go back to the browser and we can refresh this page and see how it looks. You can see we have two fields here for the name and the phone number, and we also have a submit button. Now the submit button is floating above where we would like that to be. So I'm going to add a bootstrap class to the div that surrounds the button. So let's go back to form.html. It's this div here. As well as column3, I'm going to give it a class of align_self_end. And this is because Bootstrap's column system uses flexbox, and the align attributes of Bootstrap are applied to the cross axis. So if you use the default flex row direction, then what's going to happen is the alignments are going to apply on the vertical axis. And when we align to the end, what that means is it's going to push it down to the bottom of that axis. So let's go back to the page, and hopefully that will fix this issue. And as you can see, the button is now displayed and it's more aligned with the input fields. And I'll leave a link below the video to Bootstrap's documentation on using flexbox. Now what we want to do now is add a button below this form, and that button should allow us to add a new form to this page. And this is where we're going to start bringing in HTMX into this tutorial. So what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and we're going to go back to the parent template that's including our partial. And just below this div with the ID of contact forms, I'm going to paste a button, and that's surrounded by a div just to give it some margin on the y-axis. And this button has the text of add contact. So let's go back to our page and we can see how this looks. You can see it's been given the color of green. And what we want to happen when we click this button, we want to send a request to the server that's going to return that partial that we just created, and that's the form.html partial. This contains a form element, and we want to add that into the DOM after the existing forms that are there. So we have at the moment by default one form in the document. When we click this button, we want another form to appear below the above form, and then every time we click the button we want to add a new form to the page. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to start adding some HTMX attributes to this button. So let's go to a new line here. We're going to add in get requests with the hxGet attribute, and we're going to refer to a Django URL which I'm going to call create contact. We're going to create this URL in a second, but let's close off the URL template tag. And remember, the goal here is to add a new form after the existing forms. If we go back to index.html, we have the initial form here within this div with an ID of contact forms. We want to add the new form into this div just below the existing form. So I'm going to copy the name of this ID because we're going to use that here as the hx target. So let's set an attribute called hx target, and we can set that equal to that ID. And we want the new form that's being returned by the server to be swapped into the DOM before the end of that parent element. So we're going to set hxSwap equal to before end. And if we go to the documentation for HTMX, this is the hxSwap page, which I'll leave a link to below the video. And this lists all of the possible values for this attribute. And here we have before end. And this one inserts the response after the last child of the target element. So if we go back to VS Code, we've got a target of contact forms, which remember is this div here. When we first load the page, this contains a single form, which we're using the include tag to add. When the response comes with the new form, we're going to add it after this initial one. So it's going to be added after the last child, which is the above one. And it's going to be placed into this section of the DOM here. So let's go back to our form.html. That is the structure that we're going to have to begin with. We're sending a GET request to the create contact endpoint. So we're going to go to urls.py now. And below the index view, I'm going to add a new URL here, and it's going to be for a create contact view. And you can see the name of this path, it matches what we had in the hxGet attribute. So let's now go to views.py. We're going to create a view that's going to handle this request for us. It's going to be called create contact. And we're sending a GET request to this at the moment. Later on, we're going to send a POST request to actually submit the form. So what I'm going to do for now is add a placeholder where we're going to check if the method is equal to a POST request. And if that's the case, for now, we're just going to pass. And what we're going to do in the event of a GET request is we're going to return that partial template. So we're going to return the render function. We'll pass the request to that. And the template that we're going to use here is partials/form.html. And that partial is this one here that contains the form element and the new form that we're going to add to the DOM. Now we need to actually add this form to the context that we're returning here in this HTMX response. So we're going to create a dictionary here with a key of form, and we can again instantiate the contact form, and that will then add that to the context. So let's save this file, and we're going to go back to the page now. If we go back to our web page and refresh, if we click add contact, we see that nothing is happening here. Now this is my mistake. You might have noticed this if you've been following along. I've actually added these attributes to the submit button, which is this button here. Now this submit button is what we're actually going to use to submit the form to the server. When we click the add contact button, we want to actually grab the new form. So we should have added the HTMX attributes to this button here. So what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and we're going to remove the HTMX attributes from the submit button, and we're going to go to the index.html template. And we're going to add these attributes to the add contact button. Let me tab that over. So let's try this again. If we go back and refresh the page, when we click add contact, you can see we get a new form displayed below. And we can do this multiple times, and it's always going to go to the server and get that partial template and swap it into the DOM within that ID of contacts list. And it's swapping it in before the end, so the new form appears after the last child, and we can therefore add as many forms as we want. Now the next thing we're going to do is use HTMX to actually submit the form when we click this button. So what I'm going to do again is go back to VS Code here, and we're going to go to the partial template. And to the form element, what we're going to do is add an hx post attribute, and we're going to set this equal to the URL template tag, and I'm going to reference that same create contact URL that we just created and that we're using to send the GET request to get the new form. We want to actually submit the data to the same endpoint. So when the form is submitted, which is the default trigger for a form element, it's going to send a post request to this endpoint. What we need to do now is go back to our views.py file, and we need to fill in this block when the request is a post request. So let's create a variable here for the form, and we're going to instantiate the contact form and pass the request.post data to that form, or none. That will instantiate the form, and then we can use the form.isValid function to check whether that's a valid form. And if it is valid, we can use the ModelForm's save method to create the contact and save it to the database. And if we've successfully created a contact, we're going to add that contact to the context, and we're going to return a new partial here. I'm going to pass the request, and the template that we're going to return is just contact.html, and we can pass that context to that. So now we need to go and create this new partial that contains just the details for the contact. So let's go to the partials directory, and we'll create that file here. And I'm going to keep this very simple. We're just going to paste in a list tag here, and that's going to contain the new contact's name and also their phone number that have been submitted in that request. Now you might not want to create a partial template just for something as simple as this. You can render that as a string on your Django view if you want, but I'm just going to create a partial for simplicity. Now the reason that we're returning an li element is because we want to swap this into the DOM and add it to an existing list of contacts. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually fetch a list of all contacts in the view. So let's go to this index view, which is loaded when the page first loads. And to the context, I'm going to add a new key here called contacts, and that's going to be equal to the model contact.objects.all. So basically fetching every one of those contacts from the database. So we now have this key of contacts available. We can use that within the index.html template. And we're going to add the list just below this button where we can click to add a new contact. So let's define a UL element and we'll give it an ID of contact-list. And within this unordered list, we can create a template for loop and look over each contact in that list of contacts that we've just added to the context. And remember to end the for loop. And for each one of those, we can use the include template tag, and again we'll reference the partials/contact.html, which we've just created a second ago. And that's this very simple partial template that just contains the li tag. Again, might be overkill to create a partial for this. I'm just going to do it this way to easily return a response from the server here with this render function. So let's go back to index.html. We're basically including an li tag here for every contact that we have in this list of contacts. So if we go back now and refresh the page that we have here, now we can try and add a new user here. So I'm going to try and submit this request, and you see that nothing is happening. But if we go back to the server, you can see on the terminal we have this red text here, the post request, and above that it says forbidden, the CSRF token is missing. Now the problem here is we're trying to send a post request when we submit that form, and that's an unsafe HTTP method. We need a CSRF token in that request in order to successfully send it. Now in order to solve this problem, I'm going to refer to a page here, and this is the Django HTMX documentation. This is a third-party library, and I'll link this page below the video, but basically this is the section that we're going to use here where we make HTMX pass the CSRF token. So we can copy this and add this to the body of our base template. So let's go to base.html, and this body tag here, we're going to replace that, and we're adding an hx headers attribute, and we're adding the CSRF token to the request. That's all we need to do in order to get the post request working. So let's now go back to the browser and go back to our application. If we refresh this page and we try and add another user, you can see the user has appeared in this page, but they have replaced the form. We no longer have the add contact form showing up. So what we need to do is when we return this list element, we need to change the hx target in order to add it to the end of the unordered list tag rather than replacing the entire form. So just to make that clear, let's go back to VS Code. This is the contact list, which contains all of the contacts that we have on our page. When we submit the form and we get back a new contact, we want to add it to the end of this UL tag. So again, we're going to use the before end swap technique, but we need to do that on the form element after it's been submitted. We're going to change our target rather than applying this to the form itself, which is the default if you don't specify an hx target. We're going to set it instead to the contact list. And after that, we're going to also set the hx swap attribute equal to before end. And that's the same as we did before when we were actually adding new forms to the page. This time we want to add the new contact before the end of this contact list. So let's now go back and we're going to see if this is working. We have at the bottom our existing contacts when the page first loads. If we try to add a new contact here and submit that, you can see the new contact is appearing below on the list. So that's dynamically added to the page when we submit this form. And we can click the add contact button if we need to add any more contacts. And again, we can submit that and they appear below the page. Now you might have noticed we have a situation here when we submit the form itself stays on the page with the data filled in. What we're going to do now is remove the form after it's been submitted. So once we get the response back, we want to remove the form from the document. So let's go back to VS Code and we're actually going to use a new hx_on attribute to do this. And I've just done a video on this attribute. I'll leave a link to that below the video. Let's go to form.html and I'm going to create a new line here after the hx swap. And what we're going to add here is another attribute called hx_on. And the first parameter to this is the event that we're listening for. In my case, it's going to be the after request event. After the event name, we put a colon, and then what comes after that is any actions we want to perform on that event occurring in the document. And what I want to do is call this.remove, and the keyword this refers to the element on which the hx_on request was defined, and you can find that in the documentation here. And I'll link this page below the video too. So let's go back to VS Code and we'll quickly go over this. When we send a post request to the server with our new contact, we'll get back the data for that new contact, and what we then want to do is remove the form from the document so that the user doesn't submit the form again by accident. Once it's submitted, we remove it. So let's now go back to the page and we can test this out. I'm going to add another user here, and again we'll submit that, and you can see that when we do submit that, the form is now removed from the document. And we can add a couple of new users here, and again once we submit these, it's going to remove each one of the forms one at a time from the document. So we've seen here how to use the hx_on attribute to remove elements from the DOM when an action occurs. Let's now take this a step further. Imagine we had multiple of these contact forms on the page, but instead of clicking submit one at a time, we wanted a button that allowed us to submit all of these forms at once. What I'm going to do is add another button to the right of the add contact button, and that's going to be a submit all button. So let's go back to VS Code, and it's going to be in the index.html template, and we have the add contact button here. What we're going to do below that is add a new button here, and this is just a button that contains some text called submit all. And an important thing to note is that we have an ID here called submit all. We're going to use that ID when we're triggering a submit of all of these forms. For now, let's go back to the individual forms and remove the submit button from that form. If we go back to the page now, we can see that we have a different UI. We don't have a submit button on the right hand side. We have multiple forms and a submit all button. Now the question is, how do we submit every single form on this page? Just by clicking one button. So what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and this form element at the top, this is what sends a post request for each one of the forms to the back end in order to create the contact in the database. Now the default trigger for a form element is the submit event, but of course we cannot submit this form anymore because we've removed the individual buttons that are tied to the form, so we can't submit them one at a time. We want to submit them now with this button instead. So what we're going to need to do here is define a custom trigger using the hxTrigger attribute, and the trigger is going to be a click event, but we want the click event to occur on this button here that we've defined with the text of submit all. So what we're going to do is copy this ID, and we're going to go back to form.html, and we can use the from modifier and paste the ID of that button. And what that's going to tell HTMX is that when that particular element is clicked, it's going to trigger the post request to the server with the details that are in the form. And if we have multiple of these forms on the page, what this means is that when this submit all button is clicked, it's actually going to trigger the submission for every single form that we have on the page. And that's a good use case for this from modifier when you want to perform the actions based on an event that's coming from somewhere else in the document. So let's now go back to the page and we can test this out and see if it's working. I'm going to refresh this page, and I'm going to add 3 contacts here. So we've now got 3 contacts on the page. If I submit all of these, you can see that all of the forms disappear and all 3 of these users are added to the list below. So now we have a single button where we can submit all of the forms to the server, and then each one of those is going to return the response, and it's going to swap in the list element after the end of the existing list. So this is all dynamic with HTMX, and again we can just add some more forms after that and fill in some more details here. And again, when we click submit all, that's going to send that data to the server and add the contacts to the list. So let's finish this video by adding a cancel button. Let's imagine we've added one form too many to this contact list, and we don't need to add 2. Instead, we only need to add 1. We want to have a cancel button on the right hand side of the forms that's going to remove that form from the DOM. And again, in order to do this, we're going to make use of the hxOn attribute, and we're going to write some JavaScript and see the closest function that's defined in the document object model. So let's start by going to VS Code, and in the form.html, just underneath the 2 fields in the form, I'm going to add another button with a class of button danger so that it will appear red, and that has the text of cancel. So let's go back to the page, and you can see how this looks. Each time we add a new form, we're getting the 2 fields as before, but now we have a cancel button on the right hand side. Now the goal here is that when we click the cancel button, we want to remove the associated form from the document. So what we're going to do is go back to VS Code, and on the button I'm going to add an hx-on attribute. And the event that we're going to listen for on this button, of course, is the click event. And when the click event occurs, we can get a reference to the button with the this keyword, and then we can call the closest function to get the closest form element. And what the closest function is going to do here, it's going to start at the current element, which is the button, and it's going to traverse up the DOM tree from the button, in this case to the div, and it's going to keep traversing up until it gets the selector that's specified as an argument here, which is the form element. So we go from the button to its parent div. When it doesn't find the form, it's going to go up to the div with a class of row, and then from that div it's going to go to the parent form, and it's going to find that element which matches the selector that we provided. And then what we want to do when we find that form, which is the closest form to the button, we want to call again the .remove function to remove it from the document. So let's go back to the browser and we can test this out. If we add a contact here, when we click the cancel button, it's removed from the document, and again that applies if there's only one form as well. And we can add more contact forms here, and we can specify new users, and when we submit the forms, that's going to submit all of them at once to the server. and it's going to swap the new contacts into this list below. So here we have a system that allows you to dynamically add forms to the page. It allows you to fill in the form details and submit all of them to the server. And we also have a cancel button that's integrated with the hxOn attribute to remove these forms from the document when the cancel button is clicked. So thank you for watching. That's all for this video. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. It would be greatly appreciated, and we'll see you in the next video.